Hello. This is the last lecture for this class. It is going to be a bit of a longer one, but today we're going to be talking about Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. We're going to skip these key terms. You guys should already know them, and move on to the genus Homo. So we've talked about this a little bit before, but within the genus Homo, we have the species Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo neanderthalensis, as well as Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens, at least as far as anatomically modern Homo sapiens, kind of hit the scene about 300,000 years ago, and obviously we are still around today, although there are differences, very slight changes in skeleton and cranial morphology between the two, but it is a very direct lineage. None of these adaptations or evolved traits are enough to categorize us as a separate species. Now here in this photo, you can see the actual morphological changes going on throughout this time. And with Homo erectus and Homo neanderthals, we still see this occipital bun. You can't really see it in this photo, but they both still have a sagittal crest, although Homo erectus has a much larger and more defined one than Neanderthals do. You can see that we've got much chunkier jaws in both of these species, as well as more prognathism. So you can see with Homo erectus, it's pretty prognathic. By the time we get to Neanderthals, it is kind of cooling down a little bit, but it's still drastically different from Homo sapiens, where we can see there's little to no prognathism. There's also still this post-orbital constriction within both of them, as well as some changes in the zygomatic arches here. With Neanderthals and Homo erectus, they tend to kind of bow outwards more. They're more angled than we see in Homo sapiens. Now, Homo erectus survived about 1.89 million years ago to 110,000 years ago. And in all respects, they had pretty modern human-like body proportions, so elongated legs and shorter arms compared to their torsos. And the most famous example of Homo erectus, which is also their typecast, is Turkana Boy. And Turkana Boy was a fairly young skeleton. Most estimates place him around 10 to 13 years old. Of course, there's no way to be entirely sure. But they had a cranial capacity of less than 1,000 cubic centimeters. Then we move on to Neanderthals. They were living and thriving about 400 to 40,000 years ago. They are our closest relative, although recently, I say recently, it's been quite a few years now, but there was a discovery of a species that has been called Denisovans. And Denisovans and Neanderthals are more closely related to each other and then interbred within one another more frequently than they did Homo sapiens, but they are still our closest relatives. But Neanderthals had this very large midface, a very angled zygomatic arch, large supraorbital ridges, which is, again, just this brow bone right here, and then a very huge wide nose and shorter and stockier bodies. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a PowerPoint that we'll go over after we finish this one. They also had a brain case of about 1,500 cubic centimeters, which was actually larger than anatomically modern humans. The difference is that while we as modern humans have a smaller overall cranial capacity, we have a larger prefrontal cortex, which is this area right here, which we are finding out more and more about. But it actually does enable higher levels of intelligence, as well as like symbolic thinking, reasoning. It aids in a lot of social characteristics, and modern humans that were ended up being large advantages for early Homo sapiens versus Neanderthals. Here you can see the direct differences between a Neanderthal skull and a modern human. And when we get to Homo sapiens, they were around about 300,000 years ago to present, obviously. And we have a lighter build than all prior Homo species. Our brain cases are about 1300 cc's, but they also change morphologically in some less obvious ways. So our skulls are actually thinner walled. We have a higher vaulted skull and a near vertical forehead. So our skulls are longer than they are wide. We also, of course, have smaller brow ridges, less prognatism. We don't have a sagittal crest or an occipital bun, and we also have smaller jaws and teeth. Um, a big reason for this is that we were beginning to eat more processed foods, and I don't mean processed like junk food from the grocery store, but we were cooking more of our meals. We weren't eating such tough meat or tough vegetation, and so we just didn't need our jaws to be quite so large and strong. And here in this image, you can see this one on the right, you can see this out of Africa theory. This still gets debated, and you're welcome to disagree with it, but it is the standard theory in anthropology, um, and it has the most evidence to support it. So DNA supports it, um, skeletal morphology supports it, radiocarbon dating, strontium testing, all of these kind of things have so far supported this theory. So you can see here that early Homo sapiens stayed in Africa much longer than Neanderthals and Denisovans did. These little red arrows will also show you how these species were interbreeding. This image on the left shows us the known range of Neanderthals. These are areas that we have found confirmed Neanderthal remains and evidence of culture. But of course, there might be some areas around this kind of parameter that we found a couple others in. And we're still learning about Denisovans, so there is a lot of work being done to kind of double check a lot of these specimens to make sure that we didn't misclassify any Denisovans as Neanderthals, or that we aren't classifying hybrids as just one or the other. You guys should watch this video called Migration Out of Africa. It'll talk a little bit more about all of this and show more of the direct paths that early Homo sapiens and our early ancestors were taking as they migrated out. So moving on, we have stone tools. This photo on the very left, you can see it kind of just looks like a chunky broken rock. And it is a very simple tool technology called Oldowan. Typically, these were flakes or choppers. They were very roughly created, and they're associated with early Homo, so about 2.6 to 1.7 BP. This one in the middle, you can see where the technology is advancing, it's getting more precise, and this is called the Acheulean tool technology. And at this point, we're starting to see more flakes and more bifacial tools, meaning that they're sharper, you can use them for more. And we also start to see hand axes hit the scene around this time. These are most often associated with Homo ergaster and Homo erectus. In this last image here on the right, you can see that there is a lot more variety in the tools that are being produced. These are Mousterian tool technologies. They're associated with Neanderthals, who carried a much larger tool assemblage than previous species. And we're seeing smaller stone flakes be utilized for all kinds of different tools, as well as blades that have longer and sharper edges. The process for producing these tools was much more efficient. So instead of having a bunch of useless debitage that was just kind of left behind, and debitage is any flakes that come off that are deemed unusable during the creation of a stone tool from a core. But instead of a lot of this depotage just being left to be or considered as a waste, Neanderthals were starting to develop methods for turning even those really small flakes into usable tools. Now, you should watch this video. It is a different one. I know the names are very similar, but go ahead and watch this one as well. And then these are all of the due dates until the very end of the semester. So Lab 12 is due on April 30th at midnight per usual. Primate presentations are due on May 1st at 11:59 for you online students. Quiz 4 is coming up. It'll be on May 4th. It'll open a few days before that, as it always does, but it'll be due on May 4th at 11:59. The extra credit survey will also open up soon. You guys will start to see like the school like CES course evaluation stuff coming up. This is separate. This is your last chance to get extra credit in. It'll be 10 points, very similar to the entry survey that you did at the beginning of the class. Just a few questions about what you enjoyed about the class, what you didn't, if you have any suggestions for improvements or ideas about labs that you think might be interesting or fun and beneficial to the class. And it's just a way for me to adjust the material for the class as well as my teaching style so that students are getting the most out of it that they can. But that'll be due on May 7th at 11:59. Now, this is a big one. Your last day to turn in late or missing work. It is May 9th at 11:59. This is a hard deadline. Anything that you turn in later than this will not be graded. I just don't have the time. I only get a couple of days after finals in to get all of your guys' papers and everything else graded and submitted to the school so that you guys even get a grade. So don't be late. In later than May 9th that is late or missing, it just won't be graded. Likewise, your primate project essay is due on May 13th at 11:59. This is another hard deadline. I have 76 students this semester. Papers just take a long time to grade, to go over all of your guys' citations and make sure they're formatted correctly and grammar and make sure that you are including all the content that you need to. And there's no way for me to get all of those graded in time for grade submissions if you don't get these in on time. So do not be late. I will not be allowing extensions. Yeah, just don't be late on these ones. I know I've been pretty lenient about late work in the past, but this last day to turn in missing or late work and this primate project essay need to be turned in on time if you want them graded. And you do really want your primate project essay graded because it is 100 points. I did get some emails about questions on how to record presentations where you can see the PowerPoint as well as yourself in the video. I don't have a whole lot of recommendations. I'm not a big tech person, but I can tell you what I personally do to record these lectures this way. I use Microsoft Teams. You guys all have access to Teams for free as a WSU student. You just have to go onto Office 365 and log in using your WSU credentials. So your password for everything else, your WSU email, and it's free. All you have to do is you click to record or join a meeting. And once you're on there, there is a little share button in the very right-hand top corner. When you click on that, it'll give you an option to either share like a tab or a window on your laptop or your computer, or to directly import like a PowerPoint. I choose the second option. I directly just import the PowerPoint because I think it's easier to see everything. And just tends to work a little better for me. Once you do that, then you want to click on More, which it has 3 little dots. It's a little bit more in the middle at the very top. When you click on that, it'll have a record and transcription options. You want to click the record one. You can do a transcription if you want, but when you go to download this video, it won't save your transcription, so it's not really necessary. But once you're done, you'll just leave the meeting. It'll process all of it, and then you can click on it. It'll take you to another tab to kind of review it, and you can download it from there. Download it as an MP4 so that we don't run into any issues with Blackboard. The only issue that I do have with Teams is if you want to edit your video afterwards, it won't save those edits. So I recommend uploading the video into Clipchamp. It works very well. It's also Microsoft, and it's very easy to use. But upload it there, do your edits then, and then you can download it and they'll be saved. If you are running into issues trying to upload your MP4 file into Blackboard, the only thing I can really recommend is to upload it to YouTube. You can make it private if you don't want anyone you know seeing it. And then just send me the YouTube link so that I can view it that way. We are going to move on. I have another little PowerPoint. This one, none of this will be on any kind of quiz or the homework or anything, but a lot of students tend to find Neanderthals very interesting, and I thought you guys might want a little bit more information about them. So if you have no interest in Neanderthals, this is when I would end the video for you. If you do, keep watching. So let's start with when Neanderthals were first found. The first Neanderthal fossil was actually discovered in 1829 in a cave near Ingus, Belgium, but it wasn't recognized as a Neanderthal until 1856. Now, the specimen that was discovered then was nicknamed Ingus II. In 1848, some more remains are found in Gibraltar. These were nicknamed Gibraltar I. And both of these were not complete skeletons. They were mostly just portions of the skull, maybe a couple other bone fragments here and there. Now, when we get to 1856, we start to see, well, people are finding more Neanderthal remains, obviously. And people start to actually wonder if these are a new species or not. But regardless, some Neanderthals remains were found in Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany. So that is where they get the name Neanderthal. But the remains were nicknamed Neanderthal I, often shortened to Neander I. And it was a partial skeleton. So it was the most complete skeleton that had been found at that point, and it became the type specimen for Neanderthals. Radiocarbon dating placed the specimen at about 40,000 years old, and it is the first specimen to also yield Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA. So when the Genome Project was finished, I can't remember the guy's name that kind of spearheaded all of that, but he started applying those same techniques to Neanderthal remains. And Neander 1 was the first one to have viable DNA for testing. Then in 1864, we see the official naming of the species to Homo neanderthalensis. This is the geographical range of Neanderthals as well. Well, it kind of spreads mostly in Europe, but also to some areas in Central Asia. And there's some noticeable sites like La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, Shanidar in Iraq, and Moustier in France. And this Moustier in France is where we get the Mousterian tool technology and how that was named. But most evidence points to Neanderthals originating from a European branch of Homo heidelbergensis. This is important because Homo sapiens also yield from Homo heidelbergensis, um, but we think that it was two separate groups of heidelbergensis. So it's pretty well established that Neanderthals were not our direct ancestors. We didn't evolve from Neanderthals. Physically, you can see here that Neanderthals were much more robust. They had very short limbs. They also had larger teeth than Homo sapiens. They were much stronger. They were also just much thicker. They had a lot more dentin as well as enamel than Homo sapien teeth do. They had more prominent brow ridges, broader noses and nasal passages, a longer and lower skull, and they were a lot of these, this like shorter, stockier build, as well as these like broad noses, were actually because they were adapted to cold climates. So Neanderthals, most of their time on Earth was spent during the Pleistocene when it was very cold. So they were going through an ice age, and this stocky build and wide noses kind of helps to conserve heat. And the wide noses actually help to circulate air as well as water as you breathe so that you don't get really dried out in your nasal cavity during these like very cold and dry climate that they were living in. The longer anatomically modern human skeleton also reflects that they originated more in a warm climate like Africa rather than being directly descended from Neanderthals. Now, there is debate about when we start to see behavioral modernity as well as culture in the human evolutionary record. But by the time Neanderthals hit the scene, there was definitely evidence of culture. We can see that with the Mousterian stone tools, but also in the hunting practices of Neanderthals. They weren't carnivores, but a very large part of their diet was made up of meat. And again, this was likely because of the climate they were living in. Obviously, meat, just protein in general, it keeps you full longer, it gives you more energy, and it can keep that all contributes to you staying warm. But they were hunting a lot of megafauna, so woolly mammoths, other giant animals like that, which means that they had to have had pretty decent and well thought out hunting techniques because these are extremely large animals. Obviously, they were also using fire by this time, and we do see some evidence of symbolic behavior, so ritual practices, symbolic objects, um, cloth and skin ornamentation, art. This can be cave art. Um, Generally, there's not a whole lot of art evidence, but that makes sense because they didn't really have all of the things that we do today. So if they were drawing in anything other than themselves or caves, it wouldn't preserve in the archaeological record. There's also evidence of them using mineral pigments. We don't see it as much on like cave art, so it's typically assumed that it was being used to like as body paint, or maybe to color clothing. They also had burial rituals. Along with that, we see some of the first obvious evidence of care for elderly and injured individuals. So there is a lot of evidence of hunting accidents and hunting injuries within Neanderthal remains, but there's also evidence that older people that were like missing teeth and weren't getting around as well as people that were significantly injured, the type where you're not necessarily going to be as useful afterwards. But they were being cared for and treated very well, despite the fact that they weren't able to contribute to gathering resources and other group needs as much. We do know that they likely lived in smaller groups of roughly 30 individuals. They were also much more territorial. There was quite a bit of fighting and other issues between groups of Neanderthals. And there is some possible evidence of cannibalism. Now, when I say there's evidence of cannibalism, this is not a typical thing seen in Neanderthals. Really, this is the first actual proof that we've found of this, but it wasn't typical or something that wide groups of Neanderthals were partaking in. But there is a site called the Krapina site in Croatia, and this is when we really start to see signs of symbolic behavior. And here you can see on these eagle talons that there are pretty precise cut marks. There's also some burnishing, which is basically like a polish on a lot of these edges where they kind of clank together. And all of that kind of gives us evidence that maybe these were used as something like a rattle or more likely as jewelry. So the holes in each of this like group photo of a bunch of talons, the holes kind of line up, so it's believed that it might have been a necklace or, you know, something kind of like that. But the evidence of cannibalism comes from a skull as well as a couple of long bones that had very precise cut marks, similar to those that you would see if you were butchering an animal that you were going to eat. Because this isn't typical in Neanderthals, though, there's a lot of questions about why this might have occurred at this one particular site. Some people suggest that it was just resource scarcity. So, as resources were dwindling and there was more competition, it was just kind of done out of necessity. That's probably pretty unlikely. Um, some people also suggest that it was ritualistic. So, maybe the fact that resources were getting harder to find, they were trying to appease some higher being. It's more likely that it was a war trophy. So the remains actually do belong to another Neanderthal. So it's thought that it was from a warring tribe, and this was their way of gloating that they won. But moving on. So we've talked a little bit before about this debate about names for Neanderthals. It's typically referred to as splitters versus lumpers. But originally, Neanderthals were named Homo neanderthalensis. This was the Linnaean name given after King's 1864 description of Neander 1. With this name, it suggests that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are a very separate species. In 1863, Huxley reclassified a lot of this and he named them Homo sapiens neanderthalensis to suggest that they were actually a subspecies and that they had a closer relationship than previously thought. Now, skeletal analysis shows little difference that Neanderthals, or little evidence that Neanderthals were direct ancestors of anatomically modern humans. The real debate comes with DNA technology advancing and testing advancing, as there is DNA evidence of interbreeding. The issue is that there isn't like a really good or strong definition of species for humans. It's not very clearly defined. There isn't like a rigidly set, group of characteristics that indicate whether something belongs in Homo, much less if it belongs in Homo sapiens. Typically, when we refer to something as a species, it is something that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. By viable, we mean fertile offspring. So a horse and a donkey can interbreed to create a mule, but the mule isn't fertile. It can't continue to reproduce. So it's not a viable offspring. Humans and Neanderthals, we know, did interbreed and they did produce viable offspring. But it gets a little more complicated than that. We've already talked about this. So we start to see the origins of Homo sapiens in Europe. It was typically thought around 40,000 years ago. Recently, there was a site discovered at the Bachokiro cave in Bulgaria, and radiocarbon testing for this cave indicates that there were Homo sapiens there about 44 to 46,000 years ago, which revises our timeline a little bit. It is the oldest evidence of Homo sapiens in the mid-latitude areas of Europe. Now, with this, because this is a fairly new study, it hasn't been peer-reviewed as much or, kind of subjected to a lot of testing. But during the testing for the site, they used a new radiocarbon dating method developed by Helen Fules. And this is a very cool method. It requires much smaller samples, which is really good because anytime you do radiocarbon dating, strontium dating, DNA testing, any of this kind of stuff, it is a destructive practice. So whatever you send for a sample, you aren't getting back. It's just gone from the record. So being able to use smaller samples is really beneficial. It is a little bit slower, but it's also more accurate. So previously, the margin of error was about 100 or 1,000 to 1,700 years, give or take. A lot of it depends on how good your sample is, how well preserved that DNA is. But with this new method, it has actually broken that margin of error down to about 300 years. That's very big. It means that they can start testing previous remains and start to clean up and tighten up that timeline for human evolution. Now, within this cave, we see evidence of Homo sapien culture. So we're seeing things like tools, animal bones, even an ivory bead. You can see the assemblage in this photo here. We know it is Homo sapiens instead of Neanderthals based on the assemblage found. So there are a lot of tools and styles that we don't typically see in Neanderthal assemblages or really see at all. However, some parts of this assemblage are very similar to a Neanderthal assemblage from the Grotte de Rune site in France. This could be, a coincidence, but it also could be the first good evidence that we have of cultural exchange between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So they were not just warring out against one another. There are actually two possible encounters for when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens met the first time, or any times. And the first time that we believe that they met was actually around 80,000 years ago in the Near East during the Ice Age. The Ice Age would have created kind of a walking path between the two continents that didn't exist previously. However, there isn't much evidence of Homo sapiens actually going any further in towards Europe, and they didn't stay for very long. We don't really have evidence of cultural exchange or anything like that. We're not totally sure if this was because Homo sapiens just realized that it was too cold up there, or if it was because the Neanderthals essentially made it clear that they were not welcome. But the second encounter was around 40,000 years ago, or 46, 47 if we go by the Bachokiro cave. And within 10,000 years of this, the Neanderthals went extinct. Now, this was not entirely Homo sapiens' fault. Neanderthal population numbers were actually already decreasing before they even had the second encounter with Homo sapiens. But we do know that some interbreeding occurred in pretty limited amounts with low rates of genetic exchange because only about 2 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA is still found in modern humans. But Neanderthals disappear around 30,000 years ago. There are a couple groups of them that managed to stick out a couple thousand years longer, but as a whole, as a viable population, they pretty well went extinct 30,000 years ago. The reasons for this are heavily debated, though. I myself believe that it is a combination of factors, but there are three main categories that people often will pick one or just two to believe in very strongly. The first is competitive, so obviously resources. There was likely competition for resources not only between Neanderthal groups and other animals, but also with anatomically modern humans as they kind of hit the scene. And this could have led to conflict with anatomically modern humans. Unfortunately for the Neanderthals, they were kind of inferior to Homo sapiens cognitively, socially, and technologically. The second category is demographic. So there is a belief that populations for the Neanderthals were declining already, and part of that was because fertility in young Neanderthal women were kind of also decreasing. But there is also a possibility, and this is still being actively kind of looked into and studied, but we're seeing some evidence that Neanderthal and Homo sapien hybrids, at least the males, were less fertile. This kind of jumps back into that splitter versus lumper debate, because while Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were interbreeding and creating fertile offspring, the fact that these offspring may have had some fertility issues kind of throws a wrench in how we define species and how we decide whether Homo neanderthalensis should be labeled just as that or as Homo sapien neanderthalensis. Now, part of the reason that their population was declining was also because groups of Neanderthals were much more fragmented. They had less cultural exchange and resource and social reliance on one another. So they weren't spreading knowledge as well as resources with one another like Homo sapiens were at the time. And whenever resources are dwindling, that can actually be very detrimental to a species. There is a newer hypothesis that, kind of similar to like Columbus and Native Americans, that when Homo sapiens kind of ventured up into Neanderthal lands, that they introduced diseases that Neanderthals had no natural protection against. The third and final category is climate changes. Obviously, the climate was starting to warm up from that ice age around there. As a result of that, a lot of megafauna and other animals were likely migrating kind of away from areas that Neanderthals typically hunted in, as well as plants and other resources like fresh watering holes and stuff like that kind of disappearing. A really popular idea is that Neanderthals were actually too specialized to that cold climate with those stocky bodies and their reliance on meat, and they just couldn't really adapt as well as Homo sapiens could. Now, the last theory, which I actually think gets written off a little bit too quickly, is the Campanian ignimbrite eruption, which occurred about 40,000 years ago. And you can see here in this image that this eruption, the ash fall, actually almost perfectly lines up with the known range for Neanderthals. And coincidentally, a lot of the groups that stuck it out a little bit longer were groups that were more kind of on the outskirts here in Central Asia. But this was not like some little tiny volcano. This Campanian ignimbrite eruption was huge. It was a super volcano. It's actually one of the largest volcanic eruptions in Earth's more recent history, much larger than Pompeii even. But obviously, along with just anyone being close to it, having to deal with magma and lava and the typical issues. This ash cloud that it produced was ginormous. It would have spread in a very large area, which not only would block sunlight, which would be detrimental to plant life as well as animal life, but the smoke and ash themselves would have created respiratory issues and illness, as well as killing a lot of plants. So this would have had a huge effect on Neanderthal populations in a time when resources were already very competitive, and they were already seeing declines in their population. It would have been very detrimental to a lot of these fragmented groups. And it, in my opinion, was likely kind of the nail in the coffin for Neanderthals as a species. But that is all I have for you guys today. Keep working on your primate projects. Let me know if you have any questions or any issues recording your lectures. I don't know if I'll be a whole lot of help with that second part, but I will try. And other than that, it has not been the greatest semester for me, but you guys have been very fun to teach and very sweet and very patient, and I do appreciate all of that. And I hope that you learned something that you didn't know before. Good luck with finals, and good luck as you guys continue your educational journey.